Right now, somewhere above your head, rain is falling that scientists say is unsafe to drink anywhere on Earth. Not near a factory, not near a city, everywhere. Every single drop carries a chemical that never breaks down, and every trace of it leads back to one small town in Minnesota. A company built it, a company knew, and a company said nothing for decades. So how does one factory end up poisoning an entire planet and get away with it? I love a good ghost town. The kind of place where the roof caved in 40 years ago and nobody ever came back to fix it. But this story is different, and I think it's actually worse, because the town in this story never emptied out. It never got a chain-link fence or a Superfund sign at the edge of town. It's still there, right now, full of families, full of kids riding bikes past manicured lawns, and most of them have absolutely no idea that they are living inside the origin point of one of the largest environmental scandals in American history. Nothing could have prepared you for what's about to happen. The town is called Maplewood, Minnesota. It's a quiet, comfortable suburb just northeast of St. Paul, the kind of place with good schools and tidy parks, and it happens to be the headquarters of a company you have used products from today. Maybe an hour ago. Maybe 5 minutes ago. That company is 3M, better known simply as 3M. And before we go any further, I want to plant something in your head that I'm going to come back to later, because it's the part of this story that genuinely disturbed me the most. There was a scientist inside this company who tried to stop what was coming. He wrote a letter. That letter could have changed everything, years before the rest of the world ever heard the words forever chemical. We are going to get to that letter. But first, you need to understand how something this small, something that started as a literal accident on a woman's tennis shoe, ended up in the clouds over Antarctica. Let's rewind to 1952. A young chemist named Patsy Sherman had just been hired at 3M. And I want you to notice the word hired loosely here, because back then the company didn't actually offer women permanent positions. She was brought on as what they called a temporary employee, the assumption being that she'd leave once she got married. Patsy had a chemistry degree and a mathematics degree, and in high school, when the guidance counselor gave her the girls' aptitude test and it told her she should become a homemaker, she demanded to take the boys' version instead. That test told her to become a research chemist. She listened to that one. The best part is still ahead. By 1953, Sherman and a colleague named Sam Smith were working on a completely unrelated military project, trying to build a new kind of synthetic rubber that could survive contact with jet fuel without disintegrating. And then, in the middle of an ordinary afternoon in the lab, an assistant spilled a small amount of one of their experimental fluorochemical compounds. It landed on her canvas tennis shoe. Water wouldn't remove it. Solvents wouldn't remove it. Nothing would remove it, and the shoe stayed spotless while the rest of the fabric around it got dirty and stained like normal canvas does. Most chemists would have written that off as a nuisance. Sherman and Smith looked at that ruined tennis shoe and saw something else entirely. Within a few years, that accident became a household name, Scotchgard. Launched in 1956, first as a treatment for wool, and it worked so well and made 3M so much money that the company built an entire chemical empire on top of it, eventually pulling in more than $300 million a year just from that one product line. Here's the detail that I think most people skip past, and it's the one that turns this from a quirky invention story into something much stranger. The class of chemicals that made Scotchgard possible wasn't actually born in a 3M lab at all. It traces back to the Manhattan Project, the same wartime research effort that built the atomic bomb, where scientists working with uranium hexafluoride gas discovered something remarkable about the bond between carbon and fluorine atoms. That bond, once formed, is almost impossible to break. Not with heat, not with bacteria, not with sunlight, water, or time. Some of the very people who helped build the weapon that ended a world war later ended up working for 3M, bringing that same carbon-fluorine chemistry with them, and the company built a business model on the exact same molecular trick that made a nuclear bomb's refining process work. That's not a coincidence I can just skip past. The chemical that would eventually rain down on Antarctica has the same atomic backbone as the chemical that helped split a uranium atom. Scientists gave this whole family of compounds a technical name, per- and polyfluoroalkyl substances, but you already know them by their nickname, forever chemicals. Because once that carbon-fluorine bond exists, in a lab, in a factory, in a landfill, in your bloodstream, it does not go away. Not in a year. Not in a decade. Not in your lifetime or your grandchildren's lifetime. And that single fact is the hinge this entire story swings on, so hold on to it. Because in a few minutes I'm going to show you exactly what happens when a company builds a global business around a substance it privately admits might never, ever break down. I also want you to understand just how deliberately this chemistry was chosen, because it wasn't an accident that these compounds ended up in so many products. The very quality that made them dangerous, that bond that refuses to degrade, is the exact same quality that made them profitable. A stain repellent that wears off after a few washes isn't worth much to a company. A stain repellent that survives forever is a product you never have to reformulate, and a customer keeps buying more of, decade after decade, without the company ever needing to explain why the old batch stopped working. Durability was the entire sales pitch. 3M wasn't just tolerating a persistent chemical because it happened to work well. Persistence was the product. Scotchgard was just the beginning. 3M quickly realized they were sitting on chemistry that could repel water, oil, grease, and stains from almost anything, and it exploded into products most of us grew up with. Non-stick cookware coatings, food packaging, firefighting foam used on military bases and airport runways across the country, stain guards for furniture and carpet, water-resistant fabric for jackets and boots. To keep up with demand, 3M built a massive production facility in Cottage Grove, Minnesota, just a short drive from the Maplewood headquarters, originally nicknamed Chemalite, and by the end of the 1950s it was already processing thousands of tons of raw material every single year. But Cottage Grove wasn't the only outpost in this empire. The company opened sister plants in Decatur, Alabama, and Cordova, Illinois, running the exact same chemistry on a smaller scale, quietly multiplying the number of communities sitting downstream and downwind of the exact same waste problem brewing back in Minnesota. By the 1960s, the Cottage Grove plant alone was generating around 4 million gallons of wet chemical waste annually. 4 million gallons, every year, of leftover fluorochemical sludge that had to go somewhere. And here's where I think the story stops being about clever chemistry and starts being about a decision, a real decision, made by real people that changed the fate of an entire region. Instead of treating that waste as the hazard internal company records show they already suspected it might be, 3M buried it. From the mid-1950s through the mid-1970s, waste from this plant was dumped into open pits at 4 separate sites scattered across the eastern side of the Twin Cities metro area, places called Oakdale, Woodbury, Lake Elmo, and right around the plant itself in Cottage Grove. Most of these pits had no lining whatsoever, no barrier between the waste and the soil beneath it. Some of the wet waste was simply released straight into the Mississippi River. Think about the geography here for a second, because it matters. These dump sites were built directly above the aquifers that would eventually supply drinking water to hundreds of thousands of people. And the company's own internal memos, the ones that would later surface in court, show that executives were already discussing how to protect 3M from, and I'm using their own language here, legal action resulting from the pollution of the groundwater as early as the 1960s. That's not a company that didn't know. That's a company already planning its legal defense before anyone outside its walls had a clue anything was wrong. Now here's where the story gets genuinely unsettling, because the warning signs didn't come decades later from outside scientists digging through soil samples. They came from inside the company itself, and they came early. In 1975, an internal 3M memo documents that independent researchers had detected these fluorochemicals in human blood samples collected in Texas and New York, nowhere near a 3M facility, and the memo specifically named Scotchgard as the likely source. Think about that. By the mid-1970s, before most Americans had ever heard the word pollution used in the same sentence as their own bloodstream, 3M already had a document acknowledging that its flagship product was showing up inside the bodies of ordinary people 1,000 miles away. The following year, 1976, the company ran a toxicology test on 10 laboratory rats exposed to the chemical. 7 of them died within 2 weeks. And I want you to sit with that number for a second, because we're not talking about a mild reaction here. We're talking about a 70% fatality rate in a controlled lab test on a chemical the company was simultaneously spraying onto couches, jackets, and carpets in millions of American homes. 3 years after that, in 1979, 3M conducted an experiment on primates. Every single monkey in the study died. A consulting scientist who reviewed the results wrote a note to company executives that has since become one of the most damning lines in this entire case. If the levels are high and widespread and the half-life is long, we could have a serious problem. That same year, the company tested fish pulled from the Tennessee River near its Decatur, Alabama plant and found the chemical there too, far from Minnesota, proving this wasn't a localized issue at all. It was already spreading through an entire river system. By 1978, 3M had quietly begun notifying its own chemical plant workers across Cottage Grove, Decatur, and Cordova, not the public, not regulators, just the employees themselves, that trace amounts of these compounds were showing up in their blood. So let's recap where we are. Dead rats in 1976, dead monkeys in 1979. Human blood contamination documented in 1975. Internal warnings about a serious problem circulating among executives. And the public knew none of it. None of it. This went on, quietly, for another 2 decades. But there was one person inside the company who couldn't just let it sit there. And his story is the one I promised you at the very beginning. So let's get into it, because I think it's the emotional core of everything that follows. His name was Richard Purdy, and he worked as an ecological toxicologist inside 3M's own environmental laboratory, which meant his entire job was studying how the company's chemicals moved through the natural world. In the 1990s, Purdy started testing wildlife, and what he found alarmed him. He detected the chemical in the blood of bald eagles. Not eagles near a factory. Wild eagles, far from any obvious source of contamination. He also found it inside the livers of laboratory rats that had never been deliberately exposed to it in any experiment. And when he traced the source, he realized it was coming through their food, through fish that had already absorbed the chemical from contaminated water. If it was in eagles, and it was in fish, and it was moving up the food chain that efficiently, Purdy reasoned that whales, seals, and other fish-eating animals around the world were probably contaminated too, and he pushed his superiors to let him find out. Their response tells you everything you need to know about how this company operated at the highest levels. An attorney inside the corporate division, a man named Thomas DePasquale, wrote an internal email dismissing the urgency of Purdy's concern, stating, and I'm quoting this directly, "I'm not sure there is a need to support or refute the hypothesis within any particular time frame. In other words, don't rush to find out whether we might be poisoning marine mammals worldwide." Purdy kept pushing anyway. He later described feeling like he had hit wall after wall, roadblocks, delays, indecision, his own words. And in 1999, after years of getting nowhere internally, Richard Purdy resigned. But he didn't just quietly walk away. He sent his resignation letter directly to the Environmental Protection Agency. In it, he revealed something the company had conveniently left out of its official disclosures. 3M had told federal regulators that the chemical had been found in the blood of animals, technically true, vague enough to sound minor, but they never mentioned that among those animals were baby eaglets, a detail that made the scope of environmental contamination look far more serious than the company wanted anyone to understand. That resignation letter is, in my opinion, one of the single most consequential documents in this entire saga, because it's the moment the wall of silence finally cracked from the inside. The Environmental Protection Agency opened an investigation that same year. What strikes me most about Purdy's story, the more I sat with it, is how ordinary his motivations actually were. He wasn't an activist. He wasn't trying to take the company down. He was a scientist who kept asking to be allowed to finish the experiment over and over and kept getting told to wait. Years later, in an interview, he called forever chemicals potentially the most insidious pollutant that humanity has created, and he said it not as an outsider throwing a grenade, but as a man who had spent a career on the inside, watching the company he worked for choose delay after delay at every single fork in the road where it could have chosen otherwise. Purdy wasn't the only one inside the building raising alarms, either. Around the same time, a chemist named Chris Hansen was running blood tests that confirmed just how widespread this contamination had already become. And in a later interview, she described presenting her findings to top executives and watching, in her words, the chief executive fall asleep during her presentation. I don't think I need to add much commentary to that image. A scientist stands in front of the most powerful people in the company, holding evidence that the company's flagship chemistry has spread into the general population's bloodstream, and the person at the top of the org chart falls asleep. Faced with a federal investigation now underway and mounting internal evidence it could no longer control, 3M made its move. In the year 2000, the company announced what it called a voluntary phase-out of the two chemicals at the center of the controversy, known by their abbreviations PFOS and PFOA. By 2002, actual production had stopped, and 3M pivoted to what it described as safer, shorter-chain replacement compounds. Now, I want to plant a second seed here, because we're going to circle back to it near the end of this story. Shorter chain doesn't necessarily mean harmless. It just means different. Keep that in the back of your mind. If you're finding this as unsettling as I did while researching it, this is exactly the kind of story this channel exists to tell, the places history tried to quietly bury, and the people who refused to let that happen. If you want more of these, stick around, because we're only about halfway through this one, and it gets worse before it gets better. For years after 3M stopped manufacturing the chemical, the public conversation mostly died down. The plant had switched formulas. The company had technically complied with regulatory pressure. Case closed, right? Wrong. Because burying something in the ground doesn't make it disappear, it just makes it patient. In 2004, routine groundwater testing near one of those old dump sites east of St. Paul turned up something officials weren't expecting. Trace amounts of the very chemicals 3M had supposedly phased out 2 years earlier, sitting in the water table, decades after they were first buried. And once investigators started pulling on that thread, the scale of what they found was staggering. The contamination had seeped downward into two major underground water sources, the Prairie du Chien and Jordan aquifers, spreading outward from those original dump sites in Oakdale, Woodbury, Lake Elmo, and Cottage Grove into what officials eventually started calling the East Metro Plume. This wasn't a contained leak. It was an underground river of contamination, slowly migrating through the water supply of an entire region. By the time the scope became fully clear, researchers estimated the drinking water of more than 170,000 residents across the eastern Twin Cities had been affected. 170,000 people. Drinking water pulled from an aquifer that had been quietly absorbing industrial waste since before most of them were born. And the plume didn't stop at the water table either. Testing later confirmed contamination stretching along more than 100 miles of the Mississippi River itself, the same river that supplies drinking water to communities far beyond Minnesota's borders. State biologists also began testing fish pulled straight out of the lakes and rivers surrounding these old dump sites, and what they found led to formal consumption advisories, warnings telling local families how many meals of local fish were considered safe to eat in a month, a strange and quietly devastating thing to have to explain to a father who has been taking his kids fishing on the same lake his whole life. Numbers like 170,000 are hard to actually feel, so let me bring this down to one person, because that's usually where a story like this actually lands. South of Oakdale, in Cottage Grove, there's a man who grew up walking his dogs near a fenced, wooded piece of 3M land not far from his childhood home, land topped with barbed wire that most kids in the neighborhood just accepted as part of the scenery. He developed a brain tumor. It affected his motor skills. It affected his short-term memory. He's married now, and a few years ago he learned he may never be able to have children of his own. Today, he filters every drop of water that comes into his house, and he still lives close enough to that same fenced 3M property to walk past it whenever he wants. I'm not a doctor, and I can't tell you with scientific certainty that his tumor came from that fence line. Nobody can, and that uncertainty is honestly part of what makes this kind of contamination so cruel. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't leave a clear fingerprint on any one person's illness. It just quietly raises the odds, community by community, family by family, for decades, while the people footing the bill in hospital rooms have almost no way to prove exactly where their disease came from. And he's far from alone. Residents in these East Metro suburbs have described entire streets where 2 or 3 neighbors within a few houses of each other were diagnosed with the same rare cancer within a handful of years of one another, the kind of pattern that feels obvious to the people living through it, and yet is maddeningly difficult to prove in a courtroom where causation has to be demonstrated chemical by chemical, disease by disease, plaintiff by plaintiff. You'd think a contamination event of this size would immediately trigger the state's full regulatory power, right? Here's where the story takes a turn that I think most people miss entirely, and it's the kind of detail that makes you want to throw your remote across the room. 2 years after 3M agreed to begin phasing out its chemical production, then Governor Tim Pawlenty appointed a former 3M employee, a woman named Cheryl Corrigan, to become the commissioner of the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, the exact agency responsible for regulating the exact company she used to work for. I'm not going to sit here and tell you that appointment automatically means something corrupt happened behind closed doors, but I will say this. If you were designing a system specifically to slow down accountability, to make sure the fox at least gets consulted before anyone touches the henhouse door, you would design something that looks an awful lot like that. It took years of pressure, but eventually the legal reckoning did arrive, and when it did, it exposed exactly how deep the deception had gone. In 2010, Minnesota's Attorney General at the time, Lori Swanson, filed a lawsuit against 3M seeking $5 billion in damages, alleging the company had known for decades that its chemicals were harmful and had deliberately withheld that information from regulators and the public in order to protect its revenue. What came out during discovery in that case is, in my opinion, the single most damning part of this entire story. More damning than the dead rats, more damning than the dead monkeys. Internal company policy, revealed through sworn depositions, instructed researchers not to write down their thoughts or hold email discussions about certain findings, specifically because of how those written speculations might look later if the company ever ended up in exactly this kind of legal discovery. Employees were told to mark internal documents as attorney-client privileged, whether or not an actual attorney was ever involved, a tactic used to shield documents from ever being read by outside investigators. Meeting minutes were edited after the fact to strip out references to health hazards. And in 1997, 3M actually handed a rival company, DuPont, a safety data sheet for one of these chemicals that included a direct warning. Quoting internal company language here, contains a chemical which can cause cancer, citing 3M's own research from 1983 and 1993. Read that again. In 1997, 3M was privately telling a competitor about a cancer risk backed by studies more than a decade old, while the American public wouldn't hear the words forever chemical for another 20 years. The case dragged on for years. Hundreds of hours of video depositions, executives and scientists grilled on camera about exactly what they knew and exactly when they knew it, and one former attorney general later described the entire fight as the most hard-fought, knocked-down, scorched-earth litigation she had ever been part of in her career. In 2018, right as that $5 billion case was finally headed to trial, 3M blinked. The company agreed to pay the state of Minnesota $850 million, a landmark settlement at the time, one of the largest environmental payouts in state history. But here's the part I think deserves way more attention than it usually gets. $850 million sounds enormous until you remember that these are forever chemicals. That settlement paid for water treatment infrastructure, monitoring programs, and cleanup efforts. It did not, and could not, actually remove the chemical from the aquifers, from the river, from the soil, or from the bloodstream of everyone who had already been drinking that water for decades. You cannot settle your way out of a molecule that refuses to break down. The money bought management. It didn't buy an ending. And Minnesota, it turns out, was only ever the opening chapter. Once the science around these forever chemicals became public knowledge, similar contamination started turning up near 3M and other chemical manufacturers' facilities all across the country, and eventually around the world. In Alabama, near that same Decatur plant, a local water authority discovered the chemical had leaked into the Tennessee River, and 3M ended up settling that case for $35 million just to fund treatment for the water utility downstream. Across the Atlantic, in the town of Zwijndrecht, Belgium, a 3M facility became the center of its own national scandal, with regulators discovering contaminated soil and groundwater so severe that nearby residents were warned against eating vegetables grown in their own gardens and against eating eggs laid by their own backyard chickens. Different country, different language, same chemical, same pattern of decades of production followed by a sudden, unwelcome discovery in the soil beneath ordinary family homes. Lawsuits multiplied fast back in the United States, too, hundreds of communities, all making essentially the same claim, that their drinking water had been poisoned by a chemical the industry had known about for decades. In June of 2023, 3M agreed to the largest settlement of its kind in American history, committing up to $12.5 billion, with a guaranteed floor of just over $10 billion, payable over 13 years, to help public water suppliers across the entire United States test for and treat this contamination. $12.5 billion. Let that number sit next to the $850 million from Minnesota for a second, and you start to understand just how far beyond one town, one plume, and one state this problem had actually spread. As part of these mounting settlements, 3M announced it will completely exit all manufacturing of these chemicals worldwide by the end of 2025, closing the book, at least on paper, on a chemical family the company first commercialized nearly 70 years earlier. Here's the second CTA I promised you, and it's a short one, because I'd rather you keep watching than keep listening to me talk about subscribing. If you want to see where the next town on this list is, and trust me, this list is nowhere close to finished, hitting subscribe is the easiest way to make sure it shows up in front of you when it drops. Now let's go back to the opening image I gave you, because I think this is where the whole story finally clicks into place. Remember, I told you rain falling right now, somewhere above your head, is considered unsafe to drink almost anywhere on the planet. That's not hyperbole for a video hook. That's a real scientific finding. In 2022, researchers at Stockholm University published a study testing rainwater samples collected from around the globe, including some of the most remote, untouched places left on Earth. The Tibetan Plateau, Antarctica. Places thousands of miles from the nearest factory, the nearest city, the nearest human footprint of any kind. And they found forever chemical concentrations in that rainwater exceeding safety guidelines set by the United States Environmental Protection Agency in almost every single location they tested. The lead researcher put it about as plainly as a scientist ever puts anything. There is nowhere on Earth where the rain would be safe to drink, according to the measurements that we have taken. Nowhere. Not the top of a mountain nobody has ever climbed. Not the bottom of the world, surrounded by nothing but ice for thousands of miles in every direction. The researchers went even further than that single quote suggests, actually. They argued that these chemicals now define what they call a new planetary boundary, a scientific term normally reserved for things like the ozone layer or global carbon levels, thresholds so fundamental to the health of the entire planet that crossing them changes the safety of the whole system, not just one region of it. And according to their own measurements, that boundary has already been crossed, globally, with no realistic method currently available to bring the levels back down. The chemical that started as an accidental spill on one woman's tennis shoe in a Minnesota lab in 1953 has now cycled so completely through the planet's oceans and atmosphere that researchers describe it exactly that way, a boundary we have exceeded, and one that, by their own admission, we currently have almost no realistic way to reverse. It's in polar bear blood in the Arctic. It's in penguin colonies in Antarctica. It's in the umbilical cord blood of newborn babies before they've taken their first breath outside the womb. Scientists have linked exposure to a genuinely disturbing list of health effects, testicular and kidney cancer, thyroid disease, immune system damage, impaired fertility, and complications in pregnancy. And remember what I asked you to keep in the back of your mind earlier about those shorter chain replacement chemicals 3M switched to after 2002. Researchers are still actively studying whether those substitutes carry real long-term risks of their own, and depending on who you ask, the honest answer right now is still, we don't fully know yet. So here's where I land on all of this, and I did tell you at the start of this video that I'd share my take, so this is it. What strikes me most isn't the chemistry, and it isn't even the money, the $850 million, the $12.5 billion, numbers so large they stop feeling real after a certain point. What strikes me is the timeline. Dead rats in 1976. Dead monkeys in 1979. A resignation letter in 1999. Public discovery of the plume in 2004. A lawsuit in 2010. A settlement in 2018. A global rainwater study in 2022. That's not a single scandal. That's nearly 50 years of a slow-motion decision, made and remade, generation after generation, inside boardrooms in a quiet Minnesota suburb to keep going anyway. One accidental spill on a canvas tennis shoe in 1953 built a chemical empire that now sits inside the bloodstream of nearly every living person on this planet, and it will still be there long after everyone watching this video, myself included, is gone. That's not a ghost town story. That's a ghost chemical, and it isn't haunting one abandoned street corner somewhere. It's haunting the rain.